Hey there, ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Maximov here with you tonight. And tonight I wanted to talk to you guys about physically based real-time rendering, aimed specifically at artists and made by artists, because this is a very hot topic lately, and apparently all the info we've got to go by is mostly provided by programming folks, so I thought that would be cool to, sit down and do something that is more art-centered. I can't really talk about any piece of tech specifically, but this actually is a good thing, I think, because then we just get to cover more sort of general basics behind how everything works. I was obviously too lazy to do most of the slides, so that's why I borrowed them from different people. And if you're one of the kind folks who did that and posted that online, then thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I probably won't credit every single person in the video as I go, but I make sure to post the links to where I found those slides in the description. So yeah, let's get going. The first thing that you will notice is that physically based shading in next gen game means no more specular. Specular was an approximation because we couldn't actually do realistic reflection sufficient enough. But now we can, so yeah, goodbye spec, hello reflections. And they're looking really good, and it's definitely a step in the right directions, because this is probably one of the last biggest sort of compromises that we had to make that I can think of. But before we go into that, I wanted to take you guys through the basic light theory real quick, just to refresh the memory of those who are perfectly familiar with this, and also, help people get up to speed if they aren't really familiar with that. So basically, your usual lighting consists of your diffuse component, and your reflections and your refractions and your translucency, I guess. Well, translucency is just sort of a refraction just coming from the other side. But the main thing that I wanted to touch upon here is that the difference between diffuse and reflection is that reflection is camera or viewing angle dependent, whereas diffuse is basically sort of a static kind of reflection that you perceive no matter what angle you look at an object from. And while we are on the subject, the other very important thing here is that we are now adhering to more physically correct lighting system, right? And that actually means that we have to adhere to the first law of thermodynamics, which states that energy just can't come out of nowhere. For us sort of texturing folk, this means that every kind of material contribution that we get has to be less or equal to the incoming amount of light. The diffuse, the reflection, the refraction should all amount into the amount of light the light environment provides us. What this means for us is that, for example, if we're having more reflection, that means that we're decreasing the diffuse contribution and the refraction contributions. So there's no more unlimited brightness and just getting, light energy out of thin air. And you probably might have heard, some people talking about, as something becomes increasingly reflective, diffuse, going black and stuff like that. And this is basically where it comes from. And it's actually quite logical and makes sense. And it sort of demands nothing extra from you. But it's really cool and important to keep in mind. And we'll touch upon energy conservation somewhere down the road today too. So yeah, the other thing that I just real quick wanted you guys to know is that previously when we worked with our engines, we relied on gamma correction. Basically, gamma correction is an adjustment that the final frame received before outputting to monitors to make it, look a bit more contrasty and pretty. But what that meant that the actual pixel values in terms of like hue saturation value, right, the brightness, weren't necessarily representative of the amount of light energy that they carried. So as you can see here on this chart, the brightness of 0.5 on a scale from 0 to 1 wasn't actually 127 in terms of pixel value, but 187. And this is because of the gamma correction. But right now everything is linear, and in case you're looking around and just talking to your programmers about implementing physically based shading approach, you got to keep in mind that it's pretty much impossible without linear approach to this. So a linear graph would look like this basically, where the correspondence between the brightness of your pixel is exactly the same as, the light energy that it carries. And this is what we have now, hopefully, or you will have in the engine that you're working with. And just as a quick example, to the sides you see black and white pixels just like sort of blend in together, and you can just probably judge the 128 in brightness. That huge rectangle up top looks a tad too bright to be the median of the columns to the left and to the right. And yeah, now that you're just fully aware of your pixel brightness values and meaning your light energy, let's go on to the first very important thing that awaits us with the physically based shading, and this is the separation between metals and dielectrics. And basically, these are just two groups and they shade slightly different. And I guess most of the topics that we're going to be covering here tonight is basically the difference between the two. And the thing that I'd like to start with would be this chart. And it's actually incredibly helpful because it holds a lot of very useful information. So here at the bottom of the graph, we have angle of incidence, which basically means, well, the angle that your light hits your surface. So like the facing angle would be the 0 that we see over here, and this basically means black, right? And 90 degrees is the difference between your light ray and your, surface normal, and, at grazing angles, it basically gets brighter. And I guess a good example of that is that if the angle is actually 90, you just have light sort of just brushing right by your surface, never actually hitting that, which basically means that 100% of it is reflective. So I find it to be a nice way to think about it, because it's sort of pretty self-explanatory. And the main point that we want to, pay attention to here is that, as you can see here up top, we have our metals, and up here too, but mostly dielectrics tend to be at the bottom. And as you can see, the metals stay more or less constant as they go, and only, get brighter in their reflection slightly at grazing angles compared to dielectrics. This is very interesting because basically what that means, it means that we get different reflections at different angles. And in dielectrics and in metals, we get different kinds of variation in that. So if we take a look at, for example, this sort of wooden kind of lacquered layered material thingy, then you can see that the more grazing the angle becomes, the more reflective the surface becomes. And this is one of the biggest differences between dielectrics and metals, where dielectrics actually become more reflective, way more reflective compared to, their initial reflectivity facing angles. So at grazing angles, they become more reflective, whereas metals, they also become more reflective at grazing angles, but generally, they are way more reflective to begin with. So your angel will probably have a way to, specify whether the surface is metal or dielectric, and this is a thing number one that you define doing that. But let's keep on looking at that chart. Specular is sort of a big thing, right? It basically defines how reflective your surface is, but it's kind of tricky. So, say metal and metallicness is basically like a binary value for your surface, right? It's either metallic or it's not. And generally, specular for like a uniform material would also be just constant. And this chart here and this little blue frame basically shows that little area where we see the reflectivity of our materials. So like, I don't know, say this was chrome up here, that would be the reflectivity of chrome, which is like 0.95. Metal is way more reflective than dielectrics to begin with. And remember us talking about energy conservation? That factors in here a lot, because basically the more reflective something becomes, the lesser is the diffuse contribution. And this is really interesting, right? Because basically for some very bright metals like what we have here, their diffuse contribution is basically non-existent. So like for most of your metals, you technically won't even need diffuse because they are so reflective that you can't even see it. And if you try right now, just look around the room you will probably see that most of the metallic objects that you have in here, they have view-dependent sort of optical quality to them. And that basically means that they are more reflective than they're diffused in terms of the specular reflection that we get. And this basically means that, yeah, right now, to keep it more physically accurate, most of your metals just don't need a diffuse map, and that makes it very interesting and tricky, and gives you some room to think and optimize how this and that could work. For example, some engines just basically use your diffuse or albedo texture as the reflection texture, as a specular texture for metals. They basically just switch that. But say, what about dielectrics, right? And the thing here is that when you look at this image that we are seeing right now, you can see that metals have colored highlights. Like their reflections actually are tinted because they reflect different wavelength. Whereas dielectrics usually just have, plain old white or just, sort of real world colored or light color reflections. It means that your dielectrics don't really need a full color specular map. They just need a float value, just like a number, whereas metals actually need one because they are colored. So this provides a very interesting dilemma for authoring specular textures, because your metals need a colored, basically an RGB specular textures, but they don't need a diffuse, an albedo most of the time. Whereas your dielectrics just need a single color, not even a single color, right, just like a single channel for their specular map, and they do heavily rely on their diffuse though. Another really cool way to look at this is, oh yeah, actually most of those sort of values can be measured in real world, and it's greatly useful for metals because you can just, specify color for them. But for dielectric, here's a fascinating example for you guys that basically shows that everything is specular. Like, some people usually tend to think that some rough fabrics or like cardboard that we see here is, completely rough and basically devoid of any specular intensity. But as it turns out, it's not completely the case in this example, which is basically shot in like a home studio setup with a polarizing filter that allows you to separate your specular contribution from your diffuse or albedo contribution. Here you can see that some very sort of unspecular things that you would, at least that you would think of as being unspecular, right? Like a cotton shirt or jeans aren't shiny, right? They actually still exhibit a pretty strong specular contribution. It means that since we are making a lot of optimizations, right, specular is probably the map where you can cut corners most in the next generation. Because, your metals could use your diffuse map as their color specular thingy, and most of the dielectrics actually can get away with just a generic value for their specular intensity. And you can just control the definition of the surface with your roughness or your glossiness. Just so that you guys are not confused whenever you see some engine or whatever tool you use not actually having a specular input. Another way to look at it is that specular is mostly used for, darkening stuff. Like if you have some places like reflections in where ambient occlusion is supposed to be and you don't want to see there because it sort of breaks the illusion, then that's what you mostly will probably use your specular, input slots in your shader. Unless this is like a complex and very precise material that you really, really want to make a full-on, specular map for. Yeah, since we touched slightly upon roughness and glossiness, let's just talk about that a bit. Usually we are used to gloss maps and the term itself, but there seems to be some confusion about what the term actually means, and Wikipedia solidified my doubts on that account because basically sometimes people refer to glossiness as being two completely opposite things, where what feels to be the right meaning being something that is, shiny and reflective and has sort of a sharp highlight to it or sharp reflection. Some people actually use it in a complete opposite sense, where something with a very diffused reflection and, blurred. And here I think the term roughness helps a bit, where it basically, helps you also understand what's going on a bit, talking about the physics of it. So roughness is basically how rough your surface is. And here you see like a micro geometry slide It basically shows how light sort of gets diffused and just sort of reflects in different directions upon hitting your object. Basically, the idea behind this is that the rougher the surface, the blurrier the reflections get, because the light just gets more and more scattered. Whatever way you choose to call it at the end of the day, either roughness or glossiness, this is, what's at work here. One thing that is also important to remember, and something that is sort of from the previous generation that didn't carry over too much, is that right now we adhere to the laws of energy conservation. That means that the whiter the highlight becomes, the dimmer it has to get, because we can get energy out of nowhere. So yeah, the more spread the light energy is, the dimmer it is. And once again, this is mostly controlled by your light environment, and actually see it as a cool thing, because you have less opportunity to make mistakes, or just to make something that is not physically plausible, not realistic, and that can sort of break your image. So yeah, just keep it in mind for your glossiness/roughness maps. If you want to talk about authoring those, here's just a slide that should provide you some reference, but basically the cool thing about roughness is that it's sort of self-explanatory, right? And you can just, grab examples from real world and try to see how things will work. But they're, you can't really physically accurately measure it, like with all that specular crap. So basically just trust your gut and make sure that it looks like the kind of surface that you want it to look like, I guess. The white being super, smooth and sharp reflections, and black being so diffused that, you can hardly see, if at all, see, your reflection. So authoring that shouldn't be too hard, and you can just trust your gut on that. I'm pretty sure that there's very little room to get that wrong. The other very important thing to know here is, how do you treat the materials that are a combination of metals and dielectrics? And if they're layered and one's on top of the other, how does that behave? And basically the idea is that the topmost layer, provided it's thick enough, dictates the optical properties of your surface. So if plastic is painted with metal, it appears as a metal, right? And if metal is painted with matte paint, then it appears as a dielectric. So yeah, nothing too hard here. And finally, we're, getting our last subject, which is albedo. And albedo, I like actually the word albedo. Some people just, still miss the good old diffuse, but the idea here is that diffuse and albedo are two different things. We sort of have that notion of, diffuse has been around for quite a while, right? And we've all got used to it, and we are obviously sad to see it go. But diffuse was texture that just approximated the surface, lighting, and color, and ambient occlusion, and even specular, and whatever else we had at any given time, in the history of video games. But albedo works a bit different. Albedo is basically just the surface color, if you want to put it like that. It's like it has zero ambient occlusion, although some companies actually keep some, and there is nothing bad about it, once again, because screen space per pixel ambient occlusion is not as good yet. Probably most engine that will just be able to convincingly replace ambient occlusion in albedo textures altogether, but some choose to get rid of it, and it obviously depends on your tech. The other thing is that now there has to be no specular in your textures, and for that you use a polarizing filter for your camera, and it actually allows you to just get rid of any rays that are sort of hitting your camera lens at facing angles, and just get the diffuse light that you want in your albedo textures. And the last thing is, doing some proper lens and color correction, because I really like that image that we have to the right, because it shows you how different the color and the brightness of a surface could be. And, you will just never know. So the idea here, right, it's not that crucial if you're making your stuff for just this one particular spot in your game. Then as long as it looks good, right? It doesn't matter. But with, physically based shading and physically correct materials, you probably want to reuse that stuff as much as possible. And this is where this comes in, because the more physically accurate your stuff is authored, the more reusable it becomes, because you just don't need any more tweaking, for every specific lighting conditions or color scheme in your level that you might have. And this is just, a way to do things nicely from the get-go, basically. And yeah, that's about it, guys. Okay, so to recap real quick, physically based shading, no more specular, hello reflections. And now we're, physically accurate, so that means that we have to adhere to energy conservation laws. Your diffuse plus reflection plus refraction cannot exceed the amount of incoming light that your lighting environment provides. Also make sure that your engine operates in linear space sort of laws, and your texture pixels actually represent the amount of energy that the surface transmits. So the biggest difference that we have is the difference between dielectrics and metals, because they have different optical properties to them. And the biggest thing here is that we now have Fresnel reflections, because dielectrics down here at the bottom, they aren't very reflective at facing angles but get super reflective at grazing angles, whereas metals are just almost always reflective, which means they don't really need too much of a diffuse texture in the first place. So this would be the biggest difference, as you can see here. And now, going on to specular, because your metals are so bright, their specular contribution is super intense, which means that they don't really rely on diffuse a lot, whereas the electrics rely on diffuse a lot. But there's a catch, and the catch is that dielectrics rely on just float values reflectivity, because they reflect white light completely as it is, whereas metals, they absorb some waves, and that's why their specular reflection is colored. Also, one thing to know is that everything is specular, no matter how basically unspecular it looks. It's just the amount of roughness that the surface gets. But something even that looks as not shiny as a pair of jeans also actually possesses a fair amount of specular reflectivity to it. And basically it's mostly controlled by roughness, how your surface will be perceived in this generation, so you want to take care of that. And the rougher the surface, the bluer the reflection, but also the dimmer the reflection, because of the energy conservation laws. And offering it is pretty straightforward. Just look at this reference image or just trust your gut, and most of the time you'll get it right. Also, plastic painted with metal shiny stuff will just have metallic optical properties, whereas metals painted with something that is dielectric will have a dielectric appearance. And authoring albedo means removing ambient occlusion or just leaving just a smidge of it in there, and removing your specular contribution, and hopefully adjusting for your lens and your color of your lighting or whatever else you have in your scene or your lens, say. So yeah, that was it. Hope you guys enjoyed that. And just to sum it up real quick, the benefits of using the new physically based shading. Number one is that stuff looks better, and that's really important and real nice, provided you author it right. Also, since almost always physically plausible, you have a smaller chance of making stuff look unnatural, which means less, I wouldn't say realistic, just pleasant in general, right? Because this kind of approach has been used in many Disney stylized kind of movies. But still, we still have to, base our fantasies on some kind of reality. And this also, touches upon the way that the light is transmitted and how it works. No shame in making it a bit more natural in terms of lighting. It doesn't mean that we're limiting our stylization in any way. The other thing is that since it's more consistent, it's more reusable, and that, in the end of the day, provides a lot of potential for reusability. Some engines use some very cool stuff to allow you to author this stuff just once, and then just propagate that across the entire game. Also, since most of that stuff is physically accurate, you can actually measure it, which means that it's easier to author most of the time. Well, I mean, the normal apps stay the same, right? So we still have to go through all the processes that we were so used to, but some things, got easier. So yeah, thank you guys so much for your time. It was Andrew Maximoff here for you. I hope I made it easier for you guys and didn't just confuse you more. If you have any questions, don't hesitate and don't be shy to hit me up. I'd love to help you out, any way I can. And yeah, that's about it. See you guys next time. Keep it pretty.